Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our ESCMID and ISAC combined symposium. We will have the symposium together with my dear colleague. But before, I'd like to introduce myself. I am Dr. Unal. I work in Hacettepe University as an ID person, and I am the co-chair of this organization. And my co-chair, Dr. Skov, please.
So very welcome all of you to this combined ESCMID and ISAC symposium on climate change and the change in infections that we all see. My name is Robert Skov. I'm an MD and a clinical microbiologist by training, and I'm the current ESCMID president. And it's my really pleasure to first of all invite my colleague and dear friend from the ESCMID committee, the past president of ESCMID, Professor Annelies Zinkernagel, who is the director of the Infectious Diseases and Infection Control at the University Hospital of Zurich. Annelies Zinkernagel is leading a very active research group who is working on translational research on the virulence and the anti-infective treatment on chronic infections associated with persisters and biofilms. And Annelies Zinkernagel will speak on change in infections. So please, floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction and for inviting me to this beautiful city and fantastic conference. Welcome, everybody. So as mentioned, I'll be talking about changes in infection over time, and I will illustrate how the changes in infections are tightly correlated with changes in demographics, but also changes in climate overall. Particularly interesting and intriguing, I find, and this especially after the COVID pandemic also, is how changes in infection correlate also and go along with changes in practices we have put in action in order to prevent disease. So over time, infections have been changing quite dramatically. In particular, in the 20th century, we've seen a massive decline in mortality due to infection diseases, as illustrated on this graph. And you can see the mortality from infectious diseases declined from 797 to 36 per 100,000 until the 1990s. And this was in particular due to improvements in hygiene and sanitation, introduction of antibiotics and immunization. And all of this resulted in massive decreases in infectious diseases. However, despite all our efforts, you will see quite dramatic peaks. There was the influenza pandemic, but there's also been an increase since the 1980s, and this has been due to the HIV pandemic. So what's been going on and how are things changing? So we've improved tremendously, but despite all our efforts, we do see increasingly frequent and severe spillover events of high consequent zoonotic viruses, one of the last having been the famous COVID-19 pandemic. So what has been going on and why do we see these increases and higher consequence spillovers? At the end of the 20th centuries, we had tremendous societal and technological changes which have occurred and which are ongoing. And even before the COVID-19 pandemic occurred, we already had a doubling of infectious disease-associated mortality. Here are some numbers. For the US, they increased from 36 to 63 deaths per 100,000. And since COVID-19, these numbers have been dramatically changed. So in the following minutes, I'll be going over changes in demographics and behavior, as well as environmental change in land use, and how the breakdown of public health measures impacts infectious diseases. And this should set the stage for the following three speakers afterwards. So as we all know, demographics are changing dramatically. Not only is the number of our population increasing tremendously. The age has been increasing, and here numbers for Switzerland as well as Japan. You can see that while in 1900, only 2.5% of the Swiss population were 60. At that time, that was considered increased age, which is not the case anymore. These numbers will be increasing even more, and so for 2030, it's estimated that every fifth person in Switzerland will be at least over 60 years of age. So with these changes in demographics, we have an aging population, and the aging population is more susceptible to infection. In addition to this aging population, with advantages in our healthcare practices and technological advances, we have many people surviving with underlying diseases, such as patients with chronic kidney failures, malignancies, but also autoimmune diseases. So the overall growth with patients or individuals more susceptible to infections is increasing. We've had different eras over the time. We had flower power together with differences in sexual practices. I call it here sexual revolution. So in the 1980s, we had emergence of new sexual transmitted diseases such as HIV. But overall, we've had an increase in sexual transmitted diseases. So HIV, a devastating disease which killed many, many individuals, thanks to the new discoveries, introduction of diagnostics, as well as treatments, the antiretroviral therapies, this devastating disease has become controlled. And we're now testing and treating for prevention, and this has led to a decline in the numbers of people acquiring HIV, but also the numbers of people dying from HIV. So a huge success story over time, despite the introduction of this new disease. However, with the testing and treatment as prevention strategies we've been pursuing, people are less afraid of this disease. And as a consequence, we see rising numbers in sexual transmitted diseases, old, well-known sexual transmitted diseases, as chlamydia on the upper graph, as well as syphilis and gonorrhea on the lower graphs. These are numbers from Switzerland, but those go in parallel worldwide, and you see these sharp rises of susceptible bacterial infections, but unfortunately also increases in resistant bacterial infections. What is a problem here for adults is an even bigger problem for the unborn and newly born, as we have seen also the numbers of congenital syphilis increasing, and here numbers from the US, these outcomes were associated with adverse social determinants of health. So there's always a good and always a bad, sort of the yin and yang of infectious diseases, which has been going on for different aspects of infectious diseases. Another one of these aspects is the success story of smallpox. We managed to eradicate smallpox in the 1980s, and as a consequence of eradication, we have stopped the vaccination programs. Fantastic, right? But as a consequence, we've seen the emergence, together with these combinations of more traveling as well as sexual revolution, we've seen the outbreak of Mpox, starting in 2022. And this Mpox, this disease was endemic, where you see the blue spots on the West African regions. It was an endemic, well-controlled disease, and then with the decline of vaccination, less immunity against against pox viruses in general, and then after COVID-19, increased travel activities and different sexual practices, Mpox, the clade 2, traveled all over the world. So we had the Mpox outbreak starting worldwide 2022 for the clade 2, thanks to transmission-based precautions and reintroduction of vaccination, this could be dampened quite a bit, but we have clade 1 going crazy in parallel, so things are still going on. Again, here I would like to show that there's always two sides to the coin. We managed to curb smallpox. We stopped the vaccination program, and smallpox was an extremely good vaccine because smallpox is a DNA virus that does not undergo mutations, and there was a good cross-protectivity against other smallpox viruses. So this was a huge success story, and with stopping vaccination, we entered a new era. Another success story, but also linked to catastrophe, was SARS-CoV-2 resulting in COVID-19 disease. These are the last numbers from October 2023 from the Johns Hopkins webpage, and you can see these incredible numbers of total cases in red, total death in white, and even more astonishing and amazing numbers in green, the COVID-19 vaccinations. And again, this yin and yang, we had this devastating pandemic resulting in many, many deaths, but what it brought us was a new vaccination strategy, mRNA, which has helped us and will help in the future preventing more infectious diseases. Not only is one of the good sides of COVID-19 the introduction of the mRNA vaccines, but also that every school kid knows about preventive measures, that you can prevent infectious diseases by washing hands and using masks, right? And that's what the entire population really practiced. We were so efficient in preventing SARS-CoV-2 transmission that we also prevented transmission of other infectious disease agents, such as viruses, influenza and RSV, but also bacteria, streptococcal infections, pneumococci, as well as Streptococcus pyogenes. And the consequences we saw after we stopped these extreme prevention-based precautions. For influenza, the upper graph is the influenza curves from Switzerland. We had much higher influenza rates in 2022-23 at a much earlier time point because people were not immune against influenza anymore. And this just shows that we need a constant boosting of the host over time. That's probably one reason we have these ongoing viruses and bacteria circulating. We boost the host so that the disease severity is not as massive. After having practiced these transmission-based precautions, the individuals were not immune against these common viral infections, and the outcome was very severe, particularly also for kids, as well as the other extreme of age, the elderly, and the same went along for RSV. And together with these viral infections that increased dramatically after COVID, the same went for bacterial infections. We had a massive increase in invasive group-A streptococcal infections in Europe, as well as this year in Japan. In Japan, they kept on masking for a much longer period of time. That's why the emergence of these invasive infections emerged at a later time point. Again, we need some exposition, and we need this exposition on a continuous basis. COVID pandemic, good and bad, mostly bad, but we always have to look at the positive sides. Another bad was the breakdown of public health measures, which we not only see together with the pandemics, but unfortunately also during war times. And not only has this prevented our global progress against HIV, but it has also led to many more cases of malaria as well as vaccine-preventable diseases, such as measles, for example, which during the COVID-19 pandemic, there were multiple outbreaks due to less vaccination of the population. You can see on the right the graph, Yemen, India, Kazakhstan, Ethiopia, and Pakistan, amongst others, with huge measles outbreaks occurring, and these are ongoing. Measles has been one of the success stories over time. With the introduction of the vaccine, we curbed measles diseases tremendously. Before 1963, 2.6 million deaths per year. Since introduction of the vaccine, we could hinder 20 million deaths overall. However, people are not afraid of measles anymore because they don't see the disease. So increasing, especially in higher income countries, we see an extreme vaccine hesitancy leading to reductions in the vaccine rates. And especially for measles, which has a very high transmission efficacy, this is devastating, and we see increasing numbers, and there's been an increase of over 30% of cases globally. And to wrap up this illustration on how important it is to understand prevention as well as exposure, and that sanitation is something good, but sometimes it's too much, I would like to delve into the story of poliomyelitis. So polio was circulating everywhere. And newborn kids, when the mother gave birth, they had antibodies from their mother. They were exposed to this circulating poliomyelitis virus, and they were protected, and so they had an attenuated infection after birth during the first 6 months of life. However, with improved sanitation, these newborn kids who had the antibodies from their mothers were not exposed to the circulating poliomyelitis virus anymore because everything was so clean. And so what happened was that they were exposed to the poliomyelitis virus during their teenage years when they were not protected by the antibodies of their mother anymore, and these individuals succumbed to disease. Fortunately, poliomyelitis virus infections are mostly quite benign, and most of them are not really symptomatic. Some of them, up to 10%, can affect the central nervous system after a febrile phase, but they usually are non-paralytic. It's only 0.1 to 1% that are paralytic, and so it's really just the tip of the iceberg we see. And there was a tremendous increase in poliomyelitis cases around the world wars, specifically in the US, but also in Europe, where many succumbed to paralytic poliomyelitis. So what people did was they practiced prevention methods. Transmission events were lowered down by shutting down swimming pools. It's a fecal-oral transmission rate, right? People were kept at home, similar to what we were doing during COVID. And then thankfully also then a vaccine came up. The vaccine was introduced, the oral live vaccine, and you can see where the large arrow is, that's where the vaccination was started, and overall all the poliomyelitis cases were shut down. So clearly prevention in all the forms in infectious diseases, if possible, work. Also during the poliomyelitis pandemic, transmission-based precautions helped together with the vaccine. The vaccine, since it's an RNA-based vaccine, we have mutations there. So what is feared at the moment is poliomyelitis due to the vaccine polio. Again, a huge success story that's going on that is hampered by some vaccine hesitancy, but also by breakdowns of public health measures, as we see in the ongoing war. What's happening with the increased population numbers? I mean, the population is increasing overall. These people have to live somewhere, so they're expanding over time, expanding towards the forest to the wildlife where we have increased interactions, and thus also spreading and transmissibility of the diseases increased. The increased numbers of the population are also creating more air pollutions, and so we've seen an increased number of airborne infections and respiratory tract infections. Is this really a problem? Yes, it's a huge problem. 99% of the world's population live in areas where the air quality standards do not reach the recommended values, and it's estimated that 1 out of 9 deaths worldwide are due to this increased air pollution. When I went to medical school, everybody said, you just shouldn't smoke, right? If you smoke, you have an increased risk of cardiovascular as well as cerebrovascular disease. But for the majority, that's not really a problem. But now seeing that over 99% of the health population is exposed to this bad air quality, this is a tremendous risk. And you see on the lower graph, it's also the risk of lower respiratory infections is increasing. And as said, everybody is exposed. It's not only the bad smokers. So another factor that everybody is exposed to is, in addition to air, is the climate. And climate has been changing, as we all know. The last 10 years were the warmest, and with increase in temperature, we see more floodings, wildfire, droughts going on, which have consequences for subsequent health. These increases in temperatures also make certain vectors very happy, such as mosquitoes. And so mosquitoes also, which love thriving close to human populations, particularly the Aedes aegypti and Albopictus, they love warmer temperatures, and so they've been thriving quite readily, and along with them, certain diseases. So what has been happening is that Aedes albopictus here for Europe, 2013 to the left, and to the right, 2023. 10 years later, you see in red a massive increase of the establishment of mosquito species in these regions. An establishment of mosquito species is defined as self-sustained mosquito populations that can overwinter, even in Switzerland, and reproduce in given administrative regions. So this goes along with increased infections we're seeing. We've seen chikungunya in Italy and France. We've seen Zika in France, dengue in France, as well as in Madeira, and these are due to locally transmitted cases of these mosquito-borne diseases, also in Europe. So when we're doing travel histories, it's not only regions far away that we have to consider, but also the more local regions. Dengue, not a problem really in Europe, but it's a problem worldwide, specifically severe dengue. And we've seen a 30-fold increase over the last 50 years, and about half of the world's population is now at risk for dengue. So it's a huge issue we are encountering. However, again, on the positive side, we've made some progress in medicine, and there's some preventive actions, such as the dengue vaccines that are coming up. Not quite straightforward, let me tell you, but at least there's some hope there coming up. Another vector-borne disease is West Nile virus cases that have been seen in Europe. Again, we've seen tremendous increases in the numbers over time, not only in Europe, but in other parts of the world, even in dry and sunny Las Vegas in the States, numbers have been reported. So what can we do again here to curb this ongoing spread of mosquitoes? Obviously, we can try to kill them, but they've been adapting, and there's been an increase in insecticide resistance reported worldwide, so we will have to come up with other ways to kill the mosquitoes over time. So clearly, with the climate change, rising temperatures, various mosquito species have been adapting, proliferating. Those that have been imported, for example, to Europe, can establish themselves and cause disease. Overall, dengue associated diseases have been increasing overall. So to sum up, change in infections are occurring. It's not a new event, and that's why it's just fantastic being an infectious disease specialist because we have to adapt to the demographic changes as well as the climate changes over time. I've showed you that there are tremendous changes in demographics and behavior. The population is increasing in numbers, but also in age. Thanks to the advances in medicine, the vulnerable numbers of population are increasing, and so we have a much higher population at risk of succumbing to infectious diseases. Because the numbers are increasing, we're changing our habitats, we're expanding towards the rural and salvatic regions where we have more transmissibility occurring, and the temperatures overall are further fostering these processes. Pandemics, as well as war, lead to breakdown of the public health measures with the consequences of increased risk for transmission. And now that we can all travel, we're doing this readily. That's why we're here in Istanbul as well. And so we have also an exchange of pathogens, not only viruses, but also of antimicrobial resistant bacteria, of which you will be hearing soon more. From ESCMID's side, we are taking this very seriously. Not only is our aim to guide practice and education as well as training and improve diagnostics and how we treat patients, we also have set as a strategy to prepare for the rapidly respond to these emerging infections, which will not go away, and drive forward the response to antimicrobial resistance, which is a huge issue which you will be hearing about. So with this, I would like to wrap up and just again remind you that through globalization, antimicrobial resistance, and all these emerging infections spread globally, and to fight them, we must act globally too. And with that, I thank you for your attention. Many thanks.
Thank you, Annelies, for this very excellent talk. This paper is now open for questions.
Thanks, Annelies, for an excellent overview. So with the Group A strep invasive infections, we saw a rise, and you said that Japan is now following because they sort of had more transmission blocking sort of interventions. So where's the balance? Because people are also risk averse, they want to protect themselves, but also by protecting or overprotecting themselves, they are causing a risk or kicking the can down the road, and somehow it will catch up later. So where's the balance? How do we instruct populations when to start wearing masks and so on, and when to stop, actually? So your thoughts on that?
Many thanks for the question. So I think it all depends on the numbers, right? And during COVID-19, where we tried to prevent the overflooding of our healthcare system, that worked very well. And we had different countries practicing different preventive measures, and overall, I think it's sort of, we all reached the same point. So in more northern countries, certain northern countries such as Sweden, there was no prevention ongoing. So there people succumbed earlier to disease, and especially the vulnerable populations. But I think if you look at it on the whole scale, we all went through the same disease curriculum in different velocities. And I think for the future, and that's why I actually like to bring these peaks of influenza and RSV, we can protect ourselves for a certain time, but we can't protect us forever. And this is what I also try to tell people who are particularly afraid of succumbing to infections. I mean, immunity, without immunity, nothing works. And you need a certain exposure over time. And I think this exposure should happen. If we are not exposed, we need the protection via a vaccination. And vaccinations, if it's not a live vaccine, won't work as well as the dead vaccines. So we will not get around of being exposed on a regular basis. You can, if people are very afraid, you can maybe say, I mean, we're made up of more bacteria and viruses than our own eukaryotic cells. And so that also sort of illustrates that we cannot hide from the microbes. It's more the exposure frequency that I think will be changing. It's a difficult balance, but I find it fascinating because it just shows whatever we do, it comes back again.
Please join me in a big applause for this excellent talk. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, which is Kristina Osbjer, who is a veterinarian with a PhD in epidemiology and veterinarian public health. Kristina has worked more than 15 years on AMR, especially in low and middle income countries, and is now working on the effect of climate change on AMR. And as you see here, the title is The Effect of Climate Change on Antimicrobial Resistance. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Robert, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here with you today. So I will continue on the subject from Annelies, talking more in detail about the effects of climate change on antimicrobial resistance and the need for action and for understanding better how we can collaboratively tackle antimicrobial resistance and climate change. Just briefly, as Robert mentioned, I work for ICORS, International Center for Antimicrobial Resistance Solutions. For those of you that are not familiar with ICORS, it's an international organization based in Denmark. We are working in collaboration with governments and researchers in low and middle income countries in testing solutions to tackle AMR across the One Health sectors with projects in human health, animal health, environmental health, and cross-cutting. And we became self-governed in 2021. And at the beginning of 2024, we had 41 projects running in 20 different countries across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Most of those shown here in blue being intervention and implementation research projects, really testing interventions in collaboration with the local stakeholders, and some of them being supportive, co-funded projects, shown here in pink, and I will give you an example of such a project later on in the talk that is specifically focusing on AMR and climate change. So we know that we are facing a new situation when it comes to our climate. We are seeing increasing temperatures, we are seeing increasing incidence of drought, that leads to wildfires, we are seeing increasing flooding, extreme weathers, change in precipitation. We're also seeing melting glaciers, leading to rising sea levels and acidification of our oceans. To bring you to the very basics of what is happening, we have the solar radiation that comes into our atmosphere. Most of that is absorbed by the Earth, but some of it is going back or reflected back as infrared radiation into the atmosphere. However, the greenhouse gas emissions are stopping some of that infrared radiation from leaving the atmosphere, which keeps the Earth heating up, and that is creating the climate change. We know also that very much of this is influenced by human action. So what we are seeing is, if we look at the data for 2016 to 2020, it was the warmest year, in the warmest 5 years ever. So we are seeing increases in the temperature. Also, we are seeing that the CO2 emissions, they did not fall due to COVID-19. So we had continued rise in CO2 emissions despite COVID-19. The global fossil CO2 emissions actually rose by 65% between 1999 and 2019. We also see a rapid melting of our glaciers, which is threatening water supply for millions of people. Droughts and floods are having most of this impact. So droughts and floods are the parts of climate change that are posing most impact and the highest burden of the global population. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change releases a report every year. In the latest report, we see that there is
And there is now sufficient evidence that human action is contributing to the rise in global greenhouse gas emissions. Also, the global surface temperature increased by 1.1 degree in the last decade as compared to the last part of the 1800s. We also know some things we know more for certain, other things are a bit more uncertain. We know, for example, for certain that there is an increase in hot weather extremes, and that will continue. We also know for certain that there is an acidification of upper ocean. Other factors are less certain at the moment, but they are predicted to happen, such as increase in compound flooding and increase in wildfire weather. Looking at the latest World Economic Forum, people were asked to rank what are the highest global risks for today. And when people were asked to rank the risk for the coming 2 years, extreme weather events was ranked as a number 2. But when people were asked for the coming 10-year period, climate change linked risks were the top 4 ones that came up, including extreme weather events, critical change to Earth systems, biodiversity loss, and natural resources shortages. So this is not only a fact, but it's also a fear of many people, and people are aware that this is increasing. Now, how does that link to antimicrobial resistance? There is an alliance between antimicrobial resistance and climate change. Human action is driving both antimicrobial resistance and climate change, and there are some very close linkages between the two that I will come to in the following slides. Climate change accelerates the rate of emerging infectious diseases, as we've heard in the previous talk, but also of antimicrobial resistance, and on several levels. For example, rising temperatures have a direct impact on the horizontal gene transfer and the rising occurrence of antimicrobial resistance. Water is closely linked to both climate change and antimicrobial resistance. We know, for example, that interrupted sewage systems, that poor sanitation are key drivers of antimicrobial resistance in low and middle income countries. Climate change is anticipated to have a major impact on sanitation, sewage system, and infrastructure. We know also that the human activities are key drivers. In addition, we know that the climate change and antimicrobial resistance, they know no borders. So we need to tackle the two high global risks collaboratively across borders, and also with a very strong multidisciplinary response working across sectors. This has also been recognized by key institutions globally. So the Global Leaders Group, they have been stressing that we need more financing, political advocacy, and also coordinated global action to better understand how the converging threats of antimicrobial resistance and climate change, and also find ways for collaboratively respond to the two threats. The COP29 that just finished also recognized the need to work on these global threats collaboratively. And in addition, the UNGA meeting that finished in September this year, from that declaration, it's mentioned, for example, that we need to encourage the existing climate change and biodiversity funding mechanism to expand also and to include the scope of investments of antimicrobial resistance, highlighting that we can't tackle these risks as silos, but we need to work collaboratively for more effective use of our resources and more coordinated use of our resources. So now going to some of the details, what we know. Higher temperatures is one key aspect of climate change. The higher temperatures are increasing bacterial infection rates and also the spread to new locations. We see a faster bacterial proliferation and also increase in gene exchange due to higher temperatures. We see an increase in healthcare-associated infections. We have thawing permafrost due to high temperatures, and there are some indications that that is releasing pathogens that have been hidden for a long time, including resistant bacteria. And what we heard from Annelies as well, we see a higher incidence of vector-borne diseases because we also see a change in where these vectors are found due to higher temperatures. So looking at some specifics, this is a study that was done in the US, looking specifically on linking climate change and AMR. So in the first part of the map is a heat map looking at resistant E. coli in US. The second map was looking at minimum temperatures over the past 30 years. If you compare those two maps, you will see that they are almost similar, they're very similar, they're almost the same. The same study also did a scatter plot looking at the minimum temperature and antimicrobial resistance, specifically looking at E. coli and amoxicillin, and shows some correlation between the two. Finally, they also did look at the associations between antimicrobial resistance and increases in temperatures, and looking at the different antimicrobial classes, finding that fluoroquinolones were highly associated, whereas other classes, such as cephalosporins, were less associated with the climate change or the rising temperatures and resistance development. There was also a literature review that was done quite recently in Europe, looking at linkages between climate change and AMR. And this literature review found that warm season mean temperatures were really predictors for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, for multi-drug resistant E. coli, and also for carbapenem-resistant Klebsiella pneumonia. The same study, looking at several studies, actually 98 studies across Europe, also found that there was evidence of increasing hospital-acquired infections due to higher temperatures. Other studies have found increase in Salmonella infection, increase in Campylobacter infection due to higher temperatures. So there's quite a lot of evidence out there that there is an increase in infection, and also several studies showing that there is an increase with the higher temperature in horizontal gene transfers. But we don't only have the rising temperatures, we also have the water shortage. So the water shortage is reducing crop and animal yields. You can't produce food without having sufficient amount of water. It's also creating a situation where we have much more poor quality of the water. This leads to malnutrition and also decreased immunity to some of the resistant microbes circulating. And we have the extreme weather events. As I mentioned before, flooding is a key issue and a key risk, having a high burden globally. Flooding does accelerate the spread of resistant bacteria because we know water in itself has a great potential in spreading diseases and spreading resistant bacteria and other pathogens. Also, flooding very often leads to disrupted infrastructure and sewage line, with the overflowing of those and the risk of the spread of resistant bacteria and pathogens. Also, flooding and extreme weather events are displacing populations, forcing them to move to new areas, forcing people to move closer to animals. That itself, the overcrowding, is also facilitating a larger transmission of diseases, including resistant bacteria, between people and animals. And we have the water-driven changes. I mentioned before that we see a rise in sea level. So we have had the fastest rise in sea level in 3,000 years, according to the latest IPCC report. When it comes to the Arctic sea ice, we have the lowest level in 1,000 years, and we also we have a glacier melting that hasn't been seen in the past 2,000 years. We see also some linkages between water shortage and diseases. A study in Ghana looked specifically at the cholera incidence and found that the lack of water leading to poor quality of water and also the poor waste management were actually driving cases of cholera. And as I mentioned before, we also have the melting permafrost that is posing a risk of the release of new or previously unknown pathogens that have been hidden there for centuries, thousands, millions of years. And we have additional consequences of the flooding. I mentioned the sewage overflow already, but we also have the agricultural runoffs. So we have the manure, for example, and the resistant bacteria and microbes in the manure getting released into the environment. We furthermore have the dissemination of pollutants. So there is a linkage between heavy metals and mutations and horizontal gene transfer. There are also some indications that eutrophication and nitrogen fertilizers can further drive the development of resistance. All of this is affecting our aquatic systems, our drinking water, and the water we use for recreation, but also the water we use for our food. We also have to remember the biodiversity loss, which is partly linked to climate change, since our biodiversity is our carbon sink. We are relying on the life in our seas, we are relying on our woods to actually absorb some of the carbon. So if we cannot maintain our biodiversity, we will also have more, we will need more efforts when it comes to reducing or decarbonize the Earth. So climate change impacts the overall health of our ecosystems and also the ecosystem services. Antimicrobials, unmetabolized when used in humans and animals, they do have an impact on the microbial diversity. And vice versa, that climate change also alters soil microbial diversity, which itself can promote antimicrobial resistance. An example here is the dung beetle. And so when cattle are treated with antimicrobials, those antimicrobials are unmetabolized in the dung. They will change the microflora of the dung beetle, which then leads to changes in the behavior of the dung beetle and the ecosystem services that the dung beetle is providing to the environment. We also have to remember that low and middle income countries, they do carry the highest burden of antimicrobial of climate change, but are contributing the least to it. So if you see on top here, those are the countries, the more red they are, that contribute the most to greenhouse gases. And you see that the global north, which we know, of course, are contributing the most to the greenhouse gases, whereas the impact of climate change is the highest in the global south. And we see very similar patterns when it comes to antimicrobial resistance. So the global burden study that was released on the 2019 data also shows that the highest burden is carried by low and middle income countries. So we really need to collaboratively work and with some focus on low and middle income countries in providing more evidence. What are the current interlinkages between climate change and AMR? Because there are still a lot of knowledge gaps there. And how can we work collaboratively in addressing climate change and AMR in those countries, in those settings, across the different sectors? So as an example, in ICARS, we have just started working on a project looking specifically at these collaborative efforts. It's a collaboration between ICARS, DHSC, GAMREF, and IDRC. with the aim to bring forward both the gender and equity lens and the climate change agendas into AMR research and into AMR development projects. So it has these two streams with gender and equity and climate change. Specifically on the climate change stream, we are trying to understand as the first part of this project and document what are the knowledge and implementation gaps when it comes to AMR and climate change. This part of the project is initially focusing on livestock and aquaculture, but there's so many knowledge gaps there, and we also need to know what infrastructural changes, what policy changes are needed at regional and national level to support a collaborative effort. As a second part of this project, we are conducting scoping reviews, also doing hotspot maps, trying to overlap climate change data, both existing data, predicted climate change data, with antimicrobial use and antimicrobial resistance data to see where do we see clear overlaps, and provide knowledge resource material that can help to provide research directions in how to collaboratively address climate change in AMR, and where do we see the major knowledge gaps. And the QR code that you see down here is, in case you're interested in this project, you can join the community of action. The focus is livestock and aquaculture, but there will be a few webinars with the results coming out of this project, and there's a possibility to follow that work. So the take-home message from this is that climate change and antimicrobial resistance, they are interlinked emergencies. They do both impact the achievement of multiple of their sustainable development goals. Both climate change and antimicrobial resistance, they span the One Health spectrum. They have negative impacts for humans, for terrestrial, aquatic animals, for plants and the environment. Climate change is accelerating the rate of antimicrobial resistance, and the greatest burden of that is seen in low and middle income countries. That is why we need a better understanding of what where do we see overlaps, where are climate change and AMR contributing, where are the divergence between the two, but also understand how we can collaboratively respond to these converging threats of antimicrobial resistance and climate change. With that, thank you, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Kristina. This paper is now open for discussions.
Thank you, Kristina. That was an excellent overview. So I have a question about you showed beautifully how the climate change affect AMR. One question that I always have in mind is sometimes we have neighboring countries that have very different rates of resistance despite the fact that they have very similar climate. And obviously antibiotic practices, infection control practices all play a role. And obviously we do see that some have different types of mechanisms of resistance. So my question is there a way to think about how can we investigate the role of climate change on AMR independently of the other important factors?
It's always difficult to get the independent assessment because there's so many factors that are interlinked. And I think when it comes to the collaboration across borders, it's critical, right? So while you have national policies, national guidelines, for some of these issues, you also need some regional guidelines and regional exchange of data and coordination for the understanding. So right now, I mean, there are measures, there are quite clear criteria in how you assess the impact and the actual occurrence of climate change and antimicrobial resistance. I think now the difficulty is to merge the two and understand how the two impact each other. both how they promote each other and also how they are divergent impacts of the two.
Perhaps Adrian can help us in the future to investigate AI in trying to separate the effect of both. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I just wanted to ask, because there was a really interesting session earlier, I think it was the first day, on sustainability and sustainability of the tools that we use for infection control, masks and gowns and all of these things. And I was thinking what our role is as healthcare workers in looking at that, and if there is really good informed recommendations or studies to look at what part of our processes, so as microbiologists or as pharmacists, and the syringes and everything else that we use in our hospital systems that could participate in climate change. But also, is it what we need to focus on, or should we focus on other things? So curious to see if you've had experience with that.
Thank you for that question. I mean, there is a need both to work on climate change adaptation and the climate change mitigation. So about 5% of the carbon emissions actually come from the health sector. So there is a lot that can be done in the health sector when it comes to mitigating climate change and having better practices, overlooking the analgesia in hospitals, the waste management, the reuse of some of the material. So yes, that's one part that needs to be done, both in human healthcare, in animal healthcare, and in animal production, overall the mitigation. Maybe even more so in animal production, because animal production contributes even more, at least the terrestrial food-producing animals, even more to climate change. So I think it's an importance of understanding and differentiating to some extent between the climate change mitigation and the climate change adaptation, and looking at how those two link to antimicrobial resistance mitigation, because they will be slightly different actions. But yes, I think as part of the work that is done in laboratories, in pharmacies, in hospital settings on improving antimicrobial stewardship and improving diagnostics, to always have a thought of do an assessment of what is the impact on the environment, on these processes and on these changes that are done.
Thank you for the interesting talk. I just want to ask you about the abuse of antibiotics on livestock and the effect on climate change. Was it like increase, decrease? Was there an influence on that with the antimicrobial resistance, in fact?
Yeah, I mean, we know that livestock, in particular ruminants, are contributing a lot to greenhouse gas emissions due to the methane emissions. There's a huge amount of work ongoing there to try and reduce those emissions by changing the livestock production practices. There is much less work, I would say, on understanding the collaborative or impact, or understanding the linkages between climate smart livestock and aquaculture and AMR, than the work that has been done on understanding the linkages between climate change and AMR and human health. So much more work is needed, but there are actions such as looking at feeding practices, breeding practices, looking at overall husbandry practices that can have huge impact on reducing infections and thereby the need for antimicrobials, and also have huge impact in reducing the emissions and also improving the adaptation to climate change. Just mentioning some example, hopefully from the project that we are starting, we will get much better summary of what of these measures seem to have the highest impact and will have to be priority.
So thank you very much, Kristina, and please join me in big hand.
Thank you, Robert. And it's time for the third speaker. Let me introduce you Professor Figen Kuloğlu, my dear colleague from Trakya University, Faculty of Medicine, Department of Infectious Disease and Clinical Microbiology, Edirne, Turkey, and she has been working on rickettsial diseases for a long time, and she will talk about the climate change and the rickettsial disease. Professor Kuloğlu, please.
we have seen, climate change is one of the greatest threats to human health in the 21st century. Many key factors affect the spread of human diseases: mobility of people, animals, goods, control measures in place, availability of effective drugs, quality of public health services, political stability, and conflicts. So, existing and emerging diseases, particularly vector-borne, are increasing. Arthropods are ectothermic. Their internal temperature regulated by external environmental conditions. Vector biting rates increase with temperature up to an upper threshold. The development and replication of pathogens within the vector or in the environment occurs faster at high temperatures. Vectorial capacities consistently peak at relatively high temperatures. Ticks and tick-borne diseases are a growing burden worldwide. Factors behind this increase are detection of new pathogens and new epidemics in areas previously free of a pathogen. Rickettsial diseases are clinical zoonosis resulting from the genera Rickettsial and Aurencia. These microorganisms are small, obligate intracellular alpha-proteobacteria. Advancements in the molecular methods over the last 2 decades have greatly expanded the identification of new rickettsial species and candidates. Rickettsial species reside in an arthropod host for at least a part of their life cycle. This arthropod may be tick, mite, louse, or flea. Cycles involve horizontal transmission to mammalian hosts. Rickettsia multiply in endothelial cells of small vessels, causing a vasculitis. Vascular injury and subsequent host lymphohistiocytic response is the cause of the clinical symptoms and signs. We can categorize into 3 main groups: the spotted fever group, the oldest Rickettsial rickettsii, Rickettsial conori; the typhus group, Rickettsial provazeki, Rickettsial typhi; the scrub typhus group, Aurencia susu-gamushi, in the Asia-Pacific region. We can see Rickettsial spp as the cause of rickettsiosis in Europe. We can see the etiology, epidemiology, and ecology of rickettsial diseases here. In the spotted fever group, we have many Rickettsial. They were named according to the scientists who identified the agent, and the others were named according to the geographic area they were identified in. The typhus group Rickettsial has distributed worldwide. We see that transovarial bacterial transmission in spotted fever group Rickettsial explain why we see the patients every summer. So in a new list, we see new Rickettsial species, and this will continue to be discovered and added each year. The genus Rickettsial currently has expanded to encompass 166 species and 15 subspecies. There is an important difference in the mode of infection transmission. The spotted fever group is primarily transmitted through the bite of an infected tick. The typhus group is transmitted through inoculation, typically via infected louse or flea feces introduced through a bite, wound, or mucous membranes. Mediterranean spotted fever is the most common rickettsiosis in Europe. Rickettsia conori, subspecies conori, is the causative agent, initially documented in Tunisia. The distinctive lesion, tache noire, black spot, or escar, was initially documented in Marseille. The alternative name, glutinous fever, due to the emergence of a papillary rash instead of a macular one. This distinctive skin lesion is so important. We can see many of the rickettsial diseases, and it provides us clinical diagnosis. We can start our old doxycycline as soon as possible. We see the cases generally in summer from April, May to the end of October. The patients generally present with continuous high fever, severe headache, a maculopapular rash occurs approximately 3 days later, we must look for a black spot, a scar at the tick bite site, the inoculation scar, and we must start doxycycline therapy as soon as possible. If we delay therapy, if we begin an inappropriate therapy, the patient has a severe course and may be fatal, may die, so we have to start as soon as possible. We know that Rickettsial cholera is transmitted by the brown dog tick bite. It has a natural cycle between its arthropod and vertebrate host dogs, but humans are incidental hosts. Dogs do not prefer humans. These are our patients from the trachea region. This man is a young farmer. He has a very serious clinical presentations. This was a housewife. The black scar, physical examination is very important. We must look for an scar, and when we find it, we must start doxycycline therapy because this is pathognomonic finding, clinical finding. We can find it in every part of the body. We see a necrotic center and an erythema around this necrotic center. This is also interesting. On the right, a man, a farmer, also have doing livestock farming. He told that he cleaned ticks from his animals. On the left hand, this was a very serious case, transported from another hospital with the diagnosis of meningitis. She was given ceftriaxone, but with physical examination, we detected a scar and changed the antibiotic therapy to doxycycline. We know Rickettsial sanguineus, the brown dog tick, serves as the vector and as a potential reservoir. MSF incidence follows a seasonal pattern, peaking during high temperatures, particularly in summer in June, July, August. Warming temperatures impact the aggressiveness of Rickettsial sanguineus, leading to increased human attacks. Mediterranean spotted fever reported in all Mediterranean countries, all countries around the Mediterranean, and cases have been documented in Northern and Central Europe. We need microbiological diagnosis to differentiate. In daily practice, we use immunofluorescence assay, but we know that it gives us a retrospective diagnosis, and it gives us a result in the group basis, not in the strain basis. We can only say spotted fever group or typhus group. We can use polymerase chain reaction-based detection. We have used citrate synthase encoding gene and the outer membrane protein gene. We used OMP-A. We can, if you have a biosafety level 3 laboratory, you can try cell cultures. In 2003, we have isolated rickettsia from our patients. Yes, in daily practice, it's important we use indirect immunofluorescence assay. We know that we can say immunofluorescence assay as positive if we detect a seroconversion or a 4-fold or greater increase in antibody titers. As I mentioned, in 2003, we wanted to isolate and identify the Rickettsial strain from our patients, and we isolated in 3 patients from skin biopsies and demonstrated by PCR in skin biopsies of 9 patients. We suspected, we wondered which strain, because our cases had 40% eschar. But in the literature, it's generally reported as 70%, but ours were lower than the reported ones. I want to tell you about my city, Edirne, here. You see the border between Greece and Turkey. Meriç River is borderline. And there are many streams in this region, and there are rice fields in this region. Sorry. Meriç River divides this region into two parts. West part is in Greece, east part is in Turkey. We can easily go to Greece. The sequences of outer membrane protein A and synthase genes derived from skin biopsies and shelvial isolates had 100% similarity with the genes of Rickettsial Connery strain 7 Malish. In 2004, we again had 11 patients with spotted fever group rickettsiosis. 5 had unique scar. In the literature, typically unique scar is defined in Mediterranean spotted fever cases, single scar, but we also had 2 double scars. And 2 patients had multi-organ dysfunction syndrome, and 1 of them died. We repeated DNA sequencing, PCR tests and sequencing. Again, it was in homology with Rickettsial Connery Malish 7, different from the literature, 2 double scars. Yes, our patients with double scars. We continued to study till the end of 2009. Before doxycycline treatment, skin biopsy specimens, preferably from the scar, if there isn't, from the maculopapular rush, skin biopsies are taken, and then we made DNA extraction. At the end of our study, we had 128 patients microbiologically confirmed with the diagnosis of Mediterranean spotted fever, and the rate of scar increased to 70% of our patients. Yes. According to the diagnostic criteria of Mediterranean spotted fever developed by scar, the score was higher than 25 in each of our patients. Another important finding was that, according to PCR analysis, 73% of our skin biopsy specimens from scar and 70% of specimens from the maculopapular rush were positive, and there was no significant difference between scar and maculopapular rush. If you don't have a scar, you can take your skin biopsy from the maculopapular rush. And at the end, all of our cases were resulted as Rickettsial Connery subspecies Connery. One more important finding was that 14 of our patients, approximately 11% of our patients, had a very severe course. They had pneumonia, meningoencephalitis, multiple organ dysfunction syndrome. 2 old patients, over 70 years old, with delayed treatment, died. And as our patients were adults, we preferred doxycycline first at the beginning. If we had problems, in a few patients, we had to change to ciprofloxacin. After the treatment, fever continued for approximately 3 more days. Parol and his colleagues published 2 detailed reviews, first in 2005, the second is in 2013, and we can see the difference in the number of rickettsiosis in Europe. In 8 years, there's a there are many new identified rickettsial diseases in Europe. There are many Mediterranean spotted fever-like rickettsiosis in Europe. I will try to summarize the important ones. The most virulent subspecies is Rickettsial conori subspecies israelensis. The brown dog tick Rickettsial sanguineus is transmitting this bacteria. It was first documented in Haifa and then later in Italy, Portugal, Tunisia, Libya. Its escar rate is 27%. Fatal outcome reported in 27% of the patients. In Portugal, case fatality rate was 29%. Rickettsial helvetica identified in Ixodes ricinus ticks. In ticks, its presence has been confirmed in a minimum of 24 European countries: Denmark, Germany, Czech Republic, and Croatia. Rickettsial helvetica symptoms resemble those of Mediterranean spotted fevers. Clinical manifestations are mild, often self-limiting, but less frequently rash and scar can be observed. In human infections with Rickettsial helvetica have been reported in Austria, France, Italy, Denmark, Switzerland, and Slovakia. Rickettsial monocensis isolated in Ixodes ricinus in Germany, subsequently isolated in ticks in various European countries: Spain, Portugal, Italy, Turkey, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Germany, Sweden, Slovakia, Albania, and many. The symptoms are Mediterranean spotted fever-like. Scar and generalized rash is rare. Rickettsial sibirica subspecies Mongolotimonae is the cause of lymphangitis-associated rickettsiosis, identified in various tick species in Europe, in Greece, Cyprus, France, Portugal, Spain. The main clinical characteristics are fever, scar, and lymphangitis. Rickettsial maciliae, isolated from Rickettsial sanguineus. In ticks, it was reported in many European countries: France, Greece, Spain, Portugal, Switzerland, Italy, and Cyprus. The disease presents with high fever, muscle pain, rash, scar, liver enlargement, like Mediterranean spotted fever. Rickettsial ashlimani, identified in hyaloma ticks in many European countries: Croatia, Spain, southern France, Portugal, Italy, Russia, Cyprus, Germany, Turkey, Hungary, Greek island of Cephalonia, and symptoms are similar to Mediterranean spotted fever. Rickettsial slovaca and Rickettsial rauti causes a syndrome including scalp scar and neck lymphadenopathy. It was identified in dermocentaur ticks and documented in France, Slovakia, Germany, Spain, Poland, Italy, Hungary, Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Australia, and Portugal. As the other rickettsiosis, most often in spring and autumn, the main clinical manifestations are localized skin lesions at the tick bite site and enlarged cervical lymph nodes. The ticks particularly prefer scalp for biting. A scar is on the scalp and often surrounded by an erythema and frequently painful. Rickettsial conori subspecies Caspia is the causative agent of Astrakhan fever, endemic to the Astrakhan region around the Caspian Sea, and bites of Rhipicephalus pubilioticks is responsible, identified in ticks in Kosovo and France. In Russia, an increasing rate of Astrakhan fever is reported. Clinically similar to Mediterranean spotted fever, but an inoculation escarp is present only in 23% of patients. Rickettsial connori subspecies indica was isolated only in one patient in Sicily. No additional cases of the subspecies have been reported in Europe since then. Rickettsia sibirica, subspecies sibirica, is responsible of Siberian tick typhus in Asia, identified in Ixodes ricinus larva in Spain, but no cases have been reported from Europe. A new one, Rickettsial hochstrali, a newly discovered species in 2006 in Croatia, detected in different ticks in Croatia, Turkey, Italy, Greece, Cyprus, and Spain. The pathogenicity in humans is still to be studied. So, the list of tick-borne bacterial pathogens causing disease in humans may expand in the near future due to increased tick exposure. Many Rickettsial first identified in ticks may be found as human pathogens. Entomological search for additional pathogens in arthropods remain key to the future discovery of tick-borne bacterial infections in humans. With climate change, we are confronting unusual infections for us. In the last October, we had an outbreak of acute meningoencephalitis. This was unusual for us, and later we learned that the agent is West Nile virus. We are very close to Greece, and we know that there are outbreaks of West Nile virus in Greece. At the end, in this summer, we had an outbreak of meningoencephalitis, and we are worried about the next summer. So I'm so fast as I see. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Kuloğlu. Thank you very much for this extensive review. And this paper now is open to contributions and questions. Yes, Professor Hasan.
In clinical practice, kindly, if I may ask you, it's not easy to diagnose rickettsial infection early in the febrile illness. What were the clinical clues to make you think more of rickettsia? Was it the rash, or was it other features of the clinical illness, please? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. In 2001, I started to work in Edirne, and I was very surprised. There were severe, I'm a clinician, I'm a physician, I'm working in the clinic. There were many patients in our department, in our service. They had continuous high fever, 39, 38, continuous high fever and severe headache. At the beginning, they had continuous high fever and severe headache. Maculopapular rash occurred 3 days after. And we saw that the patients initially went to an emergency department or family physician, and they were given antibiotics, but beta-lactam antibiotics, and the clinical course getting worse. They are not healing, they are getting worse. And they want to go to the physician again because no development, no progress. So when we see the patients, and the rash occurs, and often misdiagnosed as drug reaction. It's accepted as drug reaction, but it's not a drug reaction. It's the part of his disease. So, ineffective therapy, you see the ineffective therapy, this is also an important point. It doesn't give response to antibiotics, beta-lactam antibiotics. So, high fever, headache, rash 3 days later, no response to beta-lactam antibiotics. You have to make a detailed physical examination. You have to try to find an scar. If you find, it's easy to start treatment. But if you don't find an scar, it's very hard. We have to start empirically. And approximately 3 days later, we see that the patient is getting better.
Thanks for an excellent overview. So I was wondering, like in Laos, they found 10% of meningoencephalitis was due to rickettsial disease. And you also mentioned some cases of meningoencephalitis. So are we underdiagnosing meningoencephalitis? Should we treat more these cases with doxycycline and test more in Europe or in Turkey or wherever?
Yes. We perform lumbar puncture. And we have positive antibodies in the cerebrospinal fluid. We performed antibody testing, immunofluorescence assay to the cerebrospinal fluid, and we have positivities. And of course, at the beginning, we start both ceftriaxone and doxycycline. But later, after we have enough experience, we started only doxycycline. Doxycycline is old but very important for me because it changed. We have only 2 fatal cases. It was so serious that if we couldn't start an antibiotic, an effective antibiotic, I'm sure the rate of fatality had been more greater than this level. Yes, we used doxycycline for approximately 2 weeks.
So since we don't have any more, thank you again, Professor Kuloğlu. Thank you. Dear colleagues, we move on the last, of course not the least presenter, Dr. Birnie, from MD, PhD from Amsterdam. She is the resident in internal medicine and postdoctoral researcher at the Center of Experimental Molecular Medicine and Division of Infectious Disease of the Amsterdam, UMC, Netherlands. And her main research area is to reduce the global melioidosis burden. So she has enormous experience about that disease, and she will talk about melioidosis. Please.
So thank you for this very nice introduction. My name is Birnie. I'm a fellow infectious disease consultant and a postdoctoral researcher from the Amsterdam University Medical Centers in the Netherlands. And I would like to thank the organizers of this conference and also especially the chairs for inviting me to give this presentation. And today we move on from rickettsia to melioidosis, and I will talk about the hidden burden of melioidosis. So this is a picture from Sri Lanka, which is a known endemic hotspot of melioidosis. So you might have heard 2 weeks ago there was an outbreak in a Hong Kong zoo, which killed 12 monkeys. And they performed a pathology, and they also performed cultures, and they found that the gram-negative bacterium Burkholderia sonomali was the causative agent of this disease. Eventually, 12 monkeys were killed, and one of the hypotheses is that the strain was brought in by contaminated product because they performed whole genome sequencing, and the strain was not earlier present in Hong Kong. Fortunately, no visitors nor caretakers were killed, but we know melioidosis is also common in humans. So what is melioidosis? Some of you might have heard of the disease, some of you might think never heard of this disease. Melioidosis is caused by the gram-negative bacterium Burkholderia sonomali, and this bacterium is facultative intercellular, so it can hide in any cells in the body and also can replicate inside certain cells. The gold standard of diagnosing this infection is culture from any specimen, blood, urine, sputum. And due to the intrinsic antibiotic resistance, but also due to the intercellular nature, it's very difficult to treat this infection. So you have to treat patients for a long time. 2 weeks parental phase with ceftazidime and meropenem, and a 3 to 6 months eradication phase with cotrimoxazole, depending on the disease manifestation. So melioidosis is not really a specific disease. That's why it's also called the great mimicker. Most patients present with pneumonia, more than 50% of the patients, but also people can have, like the monkeys, fulminant sepsis. So in 20% of the cases we see a sepsis, but also we see abscess formations throughout the body. So patients can present with brain abscess, musculoskeletal abscess, but also with a head-neck abscess and a prostatitis. And one of the hypotheses is that the route of infection is very important in causing the difference in disease manifestation. So people can get infected by inhalation. So you might know the literature on American soldiers who went to Vietnam and were infected by dust and got melioidosis. But people can also get infected by contaminated water. For example, in Thailand, we see lots of children with parotitis because they swim in contaminated water and they swallow water with Burkholderia absonamali. But also rice farmers are at risk for contracting and acquiring melioidosis because they have cuts in their feet and walk through rice paddies and get inoculated through their feet with Burkholderia absonamali. So we know that melioidosis has a high mortality and morbidity. And known endemic hotspots are in Southeast Asia and the northern part of Australia. 2 weeks ago, we had the World Melioidosis Conference in the northern part of Australia. That's every other year, every other third year. And, but we and other colleagues also estimated that the global burden of melioidosis is actually present across the whole tropical area. So you see how darker the red, how higher the estimated disease burden. So annually, it's estimated that 165,000 people get this disease. Most of them misdiagnosed or missed, and more of half of them dies. But we also see that Africa and South America is estimated to have this disease burden, but hardly, and no cases are reported in these regions. So recently, we performed extensive systematic review on all culture-confirmed melioidosis cases, reported in the literature from 1990 to 2022, and it's still ongoing. And so far, we included 23,000 or more than 23,000 patients. And if we look at the demographics, we see that the median age of those patients is 46 years old, and that most patients, so 2/3 of the patients, are male. And if we go to the comorbidities, we see that more than 40% of the patients with melioidosis have diabetes, but also patients have comorbidities like chronic lung disease, chronic liver disease, and chronic renal failure. Interestingly, HIV is only seen in less than 1% of the cases. And this is interesting because melioidosis is sometimes misdiagnosed as a tuberculosis, and tuberculosis is also caused by intracellular bacteria and also needs long treatment. And for tuberculosis, HIV is a very important risk factor, and we still don't know why HIV is not an important risk factor for melioidosis. 90% of the global reported cases are from the Western Pacific region, including Australia and Southeast Asia. But what about Africa? We know that the estimated burden in Africa is high, so therefore we performed several field studies in sub-Saharan Africa. For example, we prospectively monitored blood cultures in Gabon, which is in Central Africa, and we identified the first melioidosis patient there. We also digged several holes looking for this bacteria because it's a soil-dwelling bacteria, and we find and identified the bacteria in the soil of Nigeria and Gabon. We also performed a seropositivity study in healthy blood donors in the southeastern part of Nigeria, and 30% of the healthy blood donors are positive for Burkholderia absonamali. So there is a silent exposure to this pathogen, but hardly any cases are reported in this part of the world. And it's probably because of a lack of awareness and also because of a lack of diagnostic facilities. So what about the global spread of melioidosis? Our colleagues from Thailand performed a really nice study including more than 300 strains, and they performed a whole genome sequencing study. And they showed that the pathogen is probably originated in Australia and was spread during the glacial period to Southeast Asia. Then approximately 2,000 years ago, it was spread during global trade from India to Madagascar. And then during slavery, the trade of slavery, it was spread from Africa to South America. So the earlier presenters, Annelies and Kristina, highlighted important drivers of increasing rates of infections. And we believe that there are different drivers of increasing rates of melioidosis endemicity, like the epidemiological transition, global trade, and climate change. So apart from a lack of awareness, also those drivers play an important role in increasing prevalence of melioidosis. So to start with epidemiological transition, Annelies already told that and explained that the demographics change. People get older, they age more, and they have more comorbidities, which are an important risk factors for contracting melioidosis. So what does the global diabetes epidemic mean for tropical infectious diseases, including melioidosis? We know from studies from Thailand that melioidosis or that diabetes patients have a 12 times more risk for acquiring melioidosis than if you don't have diabetes. If you compare that with tuberculosis, it's a 3 times more risk. And it's still not fully determined why diabetes is such a riskful disease, but there have been some studies and we've seen impaired neutrophil function, which is important for the host defense against Burkholderia pseudomallii. If we then go to zoonotic hazards, I started this presentation with a recent outbreak in Hong Kong. So 12 monkeys unfortunately died because of melioidosis, but there are multiple outbreaks in melioidosis, like in animals across the world. For example, in Australia, there has been an outbreak in alpacas, and it was associated with an increased rainfall, which is also an important risk factor for contracting melioidosis. Then a really famous outbreak was an outbreak in a zoo in Paris in the 70s, and it started in an infected panda, which was a gift from Mao Zedong, which was an empire at the time from China. And yeah, that's also known as Le Jardin Médecin Melioidosis. And in Hong Kong, there was also an earlier outbreak in a different national park where 25 dolphins got infected with melioidosis. If we then go to other outbreaks, there is a very interesting New England paper published in 2022, where they showed that 4 patients got melioidosis, and those 4 patients never traveled to melioidosis endemic areas. And they traced back, this is a really nice study from the CDC, that all those patients or family members used a certain aromatherapy spray, which was contaminated with Burkholderia pseudomallii. It was bought at the Walmart. It was imported from India, and eventually 2 of those 4 patients died, and there were also children involved. So that's a very sad story, but it also shows that the global trade of products also can cause new endemic regions. Then there's also another interesting case in the United States. There was a woman who was infected by her tropical fish aquarium because they sequenced the water samples, or they cultured the water samples, and they found it was positive for Burkholderia pseudomallii, and they sequenced it, it was the same strain. And probably it was also imported from an endemic area. Annelies also showed that international air travel expanded in the last century. And that this can also maybe increase the spread of infectious diseases. So there have been multiple reports of traveler-associated melioidosis. I looked into the literature and I never saw melioidosis reports in Turkey, but there must be, because I think Turkish people also travel a lot. But we performed an extensive survey in the Netherlands, and we found that 1 to 3 patients per year approximately get melioidosis, traveler-associated. And they present in the similar ways as melioidosis in endemic regions, patients with liver abscess, pneumonia, you see brain abscess, but you see also head and neck abscess. If we then go to the United States, there also have been traveler-reported melioidosis patients. But recently there has been a very interesting study in the New England published last year, where they found that there were 3 patients inside the United States who never traveled abroad or never traveled to melioidosis endemic regions. And they also, those 3 patients got melioidosis. They performed an extensive environmental survey and they found the pathogen, so Burkhardia pseudomallei, next to one of the houses of the patients. So probably melioidosis is also endemic in the United States. This was in Mississippi. And the question is now, is the geographical area of melioidosis expanding because, for example, of climate change, or is this a matter of more awareness? So if we then go to climate change, we know that climate has an association with increased prevalence of melioidosis. So melioidosis cases are associated with rainfall. So if you look at studies in Australia, but also in Southeast Asia, you see that during the rainy season or after a heavy rainfall, there is increased prevalence of melioidosis. But also extreme weather events like flooding, tropical storms, typhoons are also associated with melioidosis prevalence. So there have been multiple reports in Sri Lanka, for example, which saw an outbreak after a flooding event. So what does it mean for melioidosis and other tropical infections in 10 years' time for the geographical areas and also for their prevalence rates? So we and others already advocating for the last years that it's time to recognize melioidosis as a neglected tropical disease. Melioidosis is so neglected that it's not even on the neglected tropical disease list. Yeah, we feel you. And even though it has a larger estimated burden than other neglected tropical diseases like dengue or schistosomiasis. So in blue you see the calculated disease burden, estimated, and in red you see the percentage of global investment, so which is hardly there for melioidosis. So in order to increase awareness, we, with the whole melioidosis community, organized different workshops. So for example, this was together with the World Health Organization, the first African melioidosis workshop, where we gave lectures, but also hand lab sessions in order to increase awareness, build capacity in order to diagnose, treat, and detect melioidosis. Additionally, we're always talking about melioidosis, but there is a patient behind melioidosis. So melioidosis has a high mortality, but people also luckily survive melioidosis. And when patients survive, they often have still complaints after the disease. So they have post-acute infectious sequelae. For example, on the right, you see Sri Lanka, a male who still has consequences of a transverse myelitis caused by melioidosis and has a paralysis of his left arm and also facial paralysis. So together with our colleagues in Sri Lanka, And together with anthropologists, we performed this visual ethnography in Sri Lanka. And we documented and filmed everything. And we did several interviews with multiple melioidosis survivors and family members. And we did participant observation in order to make a documentary to increase awareness about this disease. So if we go, for example, to one of our main characters, this is Mariam, and you see her sitting in her house, and at the moment we spoke to her, she was treated with oral antibiotics for melioidosis because she had a food infection. So she is a farmer, but at that moment she couldn't farm anymore because of her food infection. And one of the main things she told us that there was a large financial burden for her because she was earlier admitted to the hospital and she was still on a long-term antibiotic treatment. So we believe it's very important to visualize this and this also to show and increase awareness about this disease all across the world. So I would like to acknowledge the melioidosis community and all patients, PhD students, of course, close colleagues, but all inspiring researchers in the world. And as earlier mentioned during this session, we need to collaborate together in all single ways. And I think this is a really nice saying from the Global South. And they say, cross the river in a crowd and a crocodile won't eat you. So if you work together, you reach much further. So I would like to thank everyone, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Birnie, for this very interesting presentation.
Thank you, Emma. That was excellent, an eye-opener. My question is, are we underdiagnosing in countries that don't have this that much? I mean, I know in the US when we had the soldiers who were in Vietnam, etc., we will think about it. Does it require special laboratory, media, etc., to grow? You know, it's a bacterium, but it behaves like tuberculosis. Any ideas, any recommendations on what should we do in the lab to be culturing this more efficiently? Thank you.
Thank you for this very important question. So I really believe that it's a lack of awareness, and also if you don't look for it, you don't find it. And we see in several parts of the world, if you look for it, you will find it. And then specifically on your microbiology question, so what you need is you need to do a culture. So starting first with cultures, and we know that only 50 or 60% of the patients have a positive blood culture, even though they have probably melioidosis. So that already decreases the chance to find it. And it's a gram-negative oxidase positive bacterium. So if you do an oxidase test and a gram stain, you can already determine it. And then the third step you can do is a specific antibiotic disc test, starting with cholecystine and amoxiclavin acid, because it's resistant to cholecystine and susceptible for amoxiclavin acid, which can also separate it, for example, from Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which is commonly mistaken by, or Burkholderia cepacia. So you don't need a lot, but you really need to know that the bacteria exist, and you need to perform specific tests. And you can easily grow it on a blood agar. What we see that it needs some more time than other bacteria. So you need to culture the bottle for a couple days, 3 to 5 days, and also the agar plates, the colonies grow a little bit slower. So take your time and look for it, and then probably you find it much more. Yeah. And the important thing is that empirical sepsis treatment is most of the time ceftriaxone, and it doesn't work for this gram-negative sepsis.
Any other question or contribution? Well, obviously, as the climate change disaster is going further, we will start to see those kind of cases in the countries like Turkey as well. the number is increasing. You mentioned about the susceptibility, but because of the climate change, is there any changes in the susceptibility? Is the resistance start to be a problem?
Yeah, so that's a good question, I think. And so what we see, there's intrinsic antibiotic resistance, but we don't see so much resistance against ceftazidime and meropenem yet. So we don't know what it will do in the future, and I think it's very interesting and also very important to always look for the EMR resistant. But at this moment, we don't see so much resistance.
Yeah, the
Fortunately.
higher number of cases and the higher amount of antibiotics will be equal to resistance. Okay, thank you very much. It was very good. So, any closing?
So a few final remarks from my side. Thank you very much first of all, to all the speakers and to all of you to attend. I think this, I really have documented the change that we are seeing over time, and especially now with the changes that we are seeing due to climate change. So thank you very much from Serhat and me, and have a continued good conference. Thank you.
Thank you.